Welcome to the speaker series. Professor Midler is not able to be here today, so we're going to keep going without him. He'll be back next week. I'm Jenny Broadhurst. I'm the director of the Salish Sea Institute. We are running this series during winter quarter in partnership with Ecology, the Environment, and the Foundation for WWUN alumni. And I'm really happy to introduce Kelly Bushnell, who's here with us today. Kelly is a Seattle-based scholar of ocean humanities with expertise in historical, literary, and cultural dimensions of marine biodiversity. She's a visiting assistant professor of ocean literature at the Williams College Mystic Seaport Ocean and Coastal Studies program, and she currently serves as a board member at the Center for Open Exploration. She also teaches at Highline Community College. Kelly is a fellow with us at the Salish Sea Institute. You'll notice we have a whole series of fellows who've been working with us and producing papers and other awesome deliverables. Her project was to write this paper that she's going to be talking about basking sharks in the Salish Sea by incorporating historical perspectives and traditional ecological knowledges and addressing the colonial history of environmental destruction in the Pacific Northwest. She sought to mobilize regional knowledge through articles, policy recommendations, and seminars. You can find her paper at the Salish Sea Institute website, and I'm going to turn it over to Kelly to share her story with us.
All right, great. Yeah, and if we can minimize that one, that would be perfect. So we don't miss any shark anatomy. Perfect. Yeah, look at that. There we go. Okay, perfect. Thanks so much, Jenny. Thanks so much for having me. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I know that most of you, especially undergrads, this is required for your course, but I promise it's going to be really fun because we are talking about gigantic sharks that live right next door. So let's jump right in. So I first want to set a scene for you, as illustrated by this ink work by Preston Graves, which was made for this project. It's one of those glorious Pacific Northwest summer days. You're a kid, you've got no real responsibilities except to be home for dinner. You're out in your small boat, and maybe you're on your own, maybe you're with a friend. You might be fishing, or you might just be relaxing and getting sunburned. And it's the height of summer. And so the plankton is blooming, and as you know, that means you can't see very far into the water, maybe like a foot down in the surface. And the water's all green and full of zooplankton. The birds are diving, there's jellies of all sizes, from teeny tiny little gooseberries and comb jellies, all the way up to the big red lion's mane, which you can see this one. The lion's mane's eating the plankton, but someone else is also eating the plankton. And that school bus-sized shark swims up right next to you, like 3 times longer than your little boat, its mouth and its gills wide open, so close you could touch its sandpapery skin. Today, in 2025, all of us would probably faint, would fall right out of the boat. But 100 years ago, this might just be a normal day on the water in part of the Salish Sea. It might not even be the first shark you saw that day, or certainly not that summer. That's how much has changed in about 100 years. So until the mid-20th century, the summer months brought hundreds of enormous surface-feeding basking sharks to the Salish Sea and surrounding waters. Today, a single sighting is an isolated data point for researchers and a real shock to observers who didn't know they were even a possibility here. What I'd like to do in this talk is bring together both the history and the science of basking sharks in the Salish Sea, including historical populations and attitudes, the current state of the species, and next steps for conservation and recovery. Because while basking sharks can't see the invisible borders that separate our international lines in the Salish Sea, these boundaries have nonetheless significantly hindered our ability to steward their survival. And so too have the biological realities of the species, and so much of what we don't understand about where and how they live, both globally and in the Salish Sea. So a bit of background first, how we got to basking sharks. I was definitely one of those feral Northwest children that was sort of always wet. And when I was a student, even as an undergrad, I knew I wanted to study the ocean. I knew I wanted to be underwater as much as possible. I wanted that to be my career, so I did the only reasonable course of study, and I went to England and I got a PhD in Victorian literature. Which I know it's such a great joke, but it's also dead serious. Like, I'm dead serious because as much as I love the science and grew up, on the rainbow Lisa Frank marine biology aesthetic, as much as I love the science, I wanted to access the ocean through the imagination. I wanted to know the stories we told about it, how we've always interacted with the ocean, and to understand how our historical relationship to marine life informs science and policy today. So my research and teaching today connects the humanities with marine ecology, especially around fisheries and colonialism in the Pacific world and the polar regions. And when I'm not in the classroom, I'm usually underwater trying to get some footage of our incredible marine life here in the Salish Sea. I purposefully put our little guys here because I'm talking about one of our really big guys today. Are there any other nudie nerds in the house besides Emily? Excellent. You're my people. I knew it. Yep. So here's a few of our fun ones just around where we live in West Seattle. Our patron saint, Rachel Carson, tells us that we can't write truthfully about the sea and leave out the poetry. So let's start off with a little bit from the Irish poet Norm MacCaig. This is his basking shark poem. And he asks us, so who's the monster? The thought made me grow pale for 20 seconds while sail after sail, the tall fin slid away, and then the tail. Right? Imagine that when you're out in your little boat and you see that 3-meter tall fin. So coming to basking sharks from a historical perspective, when I set out to find basking sharks here in the archives in the Salish Sea, at first it honestly seemed as difficult as finding the shark itself. There were plenty in BC. Wallace and Gisborne have done an incredible job of cataloging early sightings on the west coast of Vancouver Island. But I really wanted to know how they used the rest of the Salish Sea, the Strait of Georgia, and especially Puget Sound. So we started with vocabulary, because basking shark turns up about 2 entries in all of the state and regional archives. So the first task was to figure out what they were actually being called. And some of the names under which I found photos or articles or entries about basking sharks have been blackfish, which we also, of course, know is sometimes used for orcas, sometimes pilot whales. So we're always disentangling this vocabulary from the actual animal. Elephant sharks, bone sharks, mud sharks, all kinds of stuff. Mud shark gets especially confusing because mud shark is also often a term historically used for our 6 gills, some of which can be as big as a small basking shark. Same thing even for our dogfish. So, and we even got into sea serpent, sea monster land, which I love, because some of those are often when we get big, really gnarly basking shark corpses winding up on beaches, especially there's a really famous one, Cadborosaurus, up in Rivers Inlet. Before we know what they are, they're always in the paper as the sea monster. So that's a really fun bit of kind of detective sleuthy work, where we also had to start seeing the archive and the animal with the same eyes, that is developing some criteria, which you have down here on the right, by which I could sort of start to look at these articles and think, all right, I think this is a basking shark and not a 6 gill based on size, that prominent dorsal fin, the lack of teeth, all kinds of stuff that will sometimes get reported in papers. And so that part is really fun. So let's meet the shark. There she is, that's Cedorhinus maximus. For around 30 million years, they've been feeding on zooplankton in Earth's ocean. The second largest fish, up to 40 feet, is about the longest one ever seen, 7,000 pounds, which is an incredible size for an animal whose prey is microscopic. Right? And as one of only 3 filter feeding, they do have little tiny teeth, but we're not really sure what they're for, maybe for breaking out of the womb. 3 Filter feeding sharks, they strain calanoid, specifically calanoid copepods are their favorite, and other zooplankton through massive gill rakers, which they shed and regenerate annually. Does anybody know what the other two filter feeding sharks are? Students, what's another one? You went for the hard one first, yeah. So the whale shark, largest fish on Earth, then basking shark, and then megamouth, yeah, who's only been seen a handful of times. Yeah, very cool. So as a species, they do have pretty global temperate distribution. You can see top right here. Those populations tend to keep to their respective oceans and hemispheres. And as a really interesting counterpoint to our North Pacific baskers, the populations around the British Isles were also hunted to near extinction in the 20th century, but their populations are rebounding, especially in Ireland and Scotland. So one question that we have is why they're recovering there but not here. So let's zoom in. Let's take a look at Cedorhinus maximus, specifically here in the North Pacific. These are our population from about Mexico all the way up to the Gulf of Alaska. Our Northeast Pacific range is our oceanic subbasin, so those adjacent coastlines in Mexico, really all down the west coast of Baja, farther south than you might think for a temperate animal. Mexico, California, Oregon, Washington State, all the way up through British Columbia and into the Salish Sea. And there's our favorite, if you attend Salish Sea Institute things regularly, you know this is our favorite view of the Salish Sea taken from the International Space Station. So orient yourself like this, north is that way. Before being driven to the edge of extinction, this population migrated seasonally along the coast of North America, utilizing the CCE, that's the California Current ecosystem. So they were up here during the summer, and they tend to go farther south and deeper in the water column during the winter. Some of the largest aggregations ever recorded occurred every summer when hundreds, and actually some research estimates thousands, hundreds or even thousands of individual sharks gathered in the plankton-rich bays of coastal British Columbia. Many of these sharks also followed their microscopic prey into the Strait of Juan de Fuca before going north into the Strait of Georgia or south into Puget Sound, even as far as Olympia. It's pretty incredible to think about that size of shark making it all the way down to Olympia, potentially without necessarily being seen. We also have sightings in Hood Canal, pretty far south in Hood Canal, and then migrating south all the way to Baja in the cooler months. So I was especially surprised and excited to find those Puget Sound photos in the archives, because that was there were folks I talked to when I asked them for their cultural memories of basking sharks who said, no, they stay in BC, they never even come down into Washington State, certainly not as far south as Seattle, and we had really no way to know. But then, here we are. So this was one of the ones, this is one of my favorites. This is July 1947. We're on the dock in West Seattle. This was one of the ones where just looking at it, we see from the caption, it says a 2,200-pound mud shark. I know it's not a 6 skill because I can count to 6. I'm an English major, but I can't count all the way to 6. There's only 5 gills on this puppy, and pretty pronounced dorsal fin there, which the 6 skill doesn't have. Right? So I know I'm looking at a basking shark. Another just wild thing about this photo is, you note the little dog. All right, that's Skipper. Skipper is, so also just the way that we're interacting with animals being really different here. It's an incredible photo. So 1947 in Ballard, 1949, 1957, 58, 59. Look at the size of this one. 59, 60, 65, 76, 78. This was actually caught in a gill net in the East Waterway of the Duwamish. So in a really industrial part of Seattle, and this is a Puyallup tribal police officer. 2014. So suffice to say, I feel slightly vindicated in knowing that I think they were and have been indeed historically in Puget Sound. So the Canadian Department of Fisheries estimates the pre-exploitation, which we consider about 1920, the pre-exploitation population in the Northeast Pacific at a maximum of about 5,000 individuals. This is a very healthy shark population, especially for such a large animal. We'll revisit that figure in a bit as we catch up with their population today. So let's look more at what that exploitation first looked like. The basking shark's historical range in the North Pacific has been continuously inhabited by humans for over 12,000 years. That is a lot of humans who potentially came in regular contact with basking sharks. In their far northern range up here, Haida, Makah, Nuu-chah-nulth, and other First Nations possess traditional knowledge of basking sharks. And ancient place names in the Nuu-chah-nulth language include places like Shark Creek, which is near to Alberni Inlet, which will play an important role later as well. Wallace and Gisborne, who did a lot of the early work on the west coast of Vancouver basking shark exploitation, they note that these ship's logs, European ship's logs from as early as 1791, are describing very large sharks in the surface waters around present-day Vancouver Island in the summer. It's typically May to August, May to September. And by the turn of the 20th century, colonial settlements throughout the Pacific Northwest had expanded and forcibly displaced First Nations, and the enormous seasonal aggregations of sharks would soon become an impediment to the burgeoning extractive economies of fish and timber. So in the first blow to the shark population, the settlers realized that the immense livers of what they were then calling these ravenous creatures, totally misunderstanding, of course, their behavior, their livers contained huge reserves of oil. And fisheries sprang up not just in Vancouver Island, but around the Salish Sea and Greater Territory to extract this resource. And while basking sharks are far more unwieldy to land than other targeted sharks that do have oil in their livers, like six-gills or our very ubiquitous dogfish, the value of the basking shark's liver outweighs the risk because the liver itself is up to 25% of the entire animal. Enormous. Okay. And in August 1921, an aggregation of basking sharks was so dense that it blocked all the shipping traffic from entering or exiting Alberni Inlet on Vancouver Island's west coast. So all of these events are kind of simmering with the demand for sharks, the demand to have the sharks removed from these commercially sensitive areas. It's all starting to come to a head. These aggregations also coincided with the summer salmon gillnet fishery. And basking sharks are infamously susceptible to entanglement. They go in one direction relatively quickly for a shark this size, and no matter what gets in their way, they don't stop. They also have one of the smaller brain-to-body ratios, so there's not a huge amount of cognitive, changing direction happening. They go in a straight line following plankton. And so many of the gill nets were being destroyed that Rivers Inlet actually organized insurance policies against lost gear. And up to 30 fishermen every year were claiming on these insurance policies. Hundreds were paying in, up to 30 were claiming insurance policies every year for gear lost to the sharks. And so attitudes about them are turning increasingly antagonistic as well. And so we start to see language like this: menace, fighter, marauder, great brute, deep sea pirate, monster, nuisance. And remember, this is about a shark that has functionally no teeth. That is really, no one has earned the gentle giant moniker, perhaps more than a basking shark. And this is how we're being talked about at this time. And so in the midst of the Second World War, the BC province ran a pretty condemning headline, which says, "War declared on BC sharks." And millions of years of evolution took only a few decades to almost completely undo. In 1949, Canada's Department of Fisheries, which is today's DFO, officially declared the basking shark a, quote, destructive pest, and initiated a directed program of annihilation which lasted 20 years. At first, watermen were instructed to shoot or ram any shark they saw, somewhat opportunistically. And when that strategy didn't eradicate the menace quickly enough, the fisheries patrol cutter Comox Post was outfitted with an enormous blade on its bow to more effectively dispatch the sharks by essentially cutting them in half, by ramming them. This is a full-page illustration in Popular Mechanics, which depicts the brutality and the efficiency of this. So you can see the blade coming out underneath the shark. The official tally in 1956 was 105 sharks killed. And these numbers on the right are the official DFO numbers from their fleet. So it doesn't capture the opportunistic killings or the killing for sport. Up from 65 in 1955, and a single day record of either 31 or 34 sharks, depending on who you ask, in a single day. In 1968, the official campaign against the basking shark located and killed just 8 sharks. In 1969, not a single basking shark was sighted in the Salish Sea or coastal British Columbia. That's how quickly the eradication happened. You'll recall the pre-exploitation population at as many as 5,000. Estimates for the total number of basking sharks killed before 1970 are as low as 1,000 and as high as 2,600. And that's just purposefully killed as part of this project. That doesn't capture opportunistic killing, sport killing, those that died as a result of being caught in gear, any of that kind of stuff. So from 1970 onward, there have been sporadic summer sightings in British Columbia and Washington, but the now fragmented population has never again met in those aggregations of hundreds, perhaps even thousands that were once really common. With just 42 sightings in BC between 1996 and 2021, the DFO's 2021 population estimate for basking sharks in the Northeast Pacific is between 320 and 530. So that's a roughly 90% decline. In fact, 25 aerial survey flights that were conducted along the west coast of Vancouver Island between 2007 and 2011 failed to observe even a single shark in their customary area. So despite no direct exploitation since this time and multiple protections, basking sharks' recovery potential in the Northeast Pacific still remains really uncertain. A 2009 population trajectory model, which, and I should just say, so some of these are international, like for instance at the bottom here, IUCN is completely voluntary. The news out of the US last week is that we're going to withdraw from IUCN entirely. And some of these are specifically, the US and Canada. A 2009 population trajectory model posits that these are a lot of ifs, if a breeding population still exists here in the Northeast Pacific, if human-caused mortality is 0 per year, it's unlikely, and if there's no further habitat degradation, also unlikely, it would take approximately 200 years to return to the pre-exploitation population level. Which sounds extremely dire, and it is, but that doesn't mean that it takes 200 years for any improvement to happen at all. So under those same conditions, potentially a 30% recovery could be possible within 45 years. And at what point, we start to see a noticeable difference in regular folks actually seeing the sharks? Not sure what that percentage is. But we don't have to wait 200 years to start seeing more of them. However, This model does caution that a human mortality or human-caused mortality of even 1 to 2 individuals a year starts pushing that trajectory out another decade. And that even more critically, if human-caused mortality reaches potentially 11 to 18 sharks per year, then we're probably looking at full functional extinction within the next 30 years or so. It's a tipping point. They're at an absolutely critical point in their conservation. So why can't we figure it out? Why can't we get it right and help them? Well, there are huge gaps in regional but also global knowledge about their biology, which makes their recovery really difficult to steward. So let's look at a few of the most pressing issues that face conservation and recovery of basking sharks in the Northeast Pacific. So what's known about their life history, especially their reproduction, presents its own challenges. They have really late sexual maturity with decades between births, really long gestations. We know they're at least a year. They may be as long as 2 to 3 years. Oh God, can you imagine? And relatively few young, like probably 6 pups, somewhere in there. It's also not well understood how basking sharks use the water column when they're not feeding at the surface. While human observers, of course, we only see them when they're on the surface, but they follow the dense concentrations of plankton into areas of seasonal upwelling. So a 2014 study found that the sharks that they followed only spent 19% of their time at the surface. And we can obviously, try to model that a little bit by figuring out where their plankton of choice goes and what depths and where they spend their time. But it's really hard to get that data on the actual sharks. In the case of one individual shark that was tagged with a tracking device near San Diego in 2011, we thought they just go up and down the coast, hang out on the surface. Well, a little less than a year later, this shark turned up 4,000 kilometers away in Hawaii and had been spending its time between 200 and 500 meters depth. Not on the surface at all. So the SIM study in 2005 does caution that population estimates that are based only on daytime surface sightings can over or underestimate the population by at least tenfold. So we have to be really careful with those kind of estimations. And basking sharks are also extremely susceptible to human interference, both intentional and accidental. So their surface behavior makes them really vulnerable to vessel strikes, because they just live in the same place, not 19% of the time. In fact, there was a study that just came out in 2024 at Taylor Chappell's lab at OSU, which is where a lot of the Big Fish Lab, which is where a lot of the really great new basking shark research is coming out of. They tagged a juvenile basking shark in Ireland, off the west coast of Ireland, with an animal-borne camera. The camera was on the shark about 6 hours before it got hit by a boat. Unbelievably, the story does actually have a happy ending. Unbelievably, the shark seems to have survived. We have the footage. The shark dives. It does seem to have survived, but 6 hours. They're also extremely susceptible to entanglement. Like I said, they swim in a straight line. Their brain is plankton, plankton, plankton. And so they have been caught in gill nets, trawls, but also even long lines, prawn traps, cod traps, anything with a line in the water, they're going to get wrapped around it. Herring seines, there have also been a number of those. And in the international waters of the North Pacific, illegal drift net fishing is also contributing to an unknown number of bycatch deaths. Also, we're talking about really big dorsal fins. And we know that dorsal fins, any kind of shark dorsal fin, is pretty desirable for shark fin soup. So those really high-priced fins have been confirmed by genetic assay in seafood markets in the US, in Japan, and in Hong Kong, despite bans on the possession of any basking shark parts worldwide. So basking sharks are also highly migratory. This is the political challenge. because they regularly cross state and international borders, exclusive economic zones, and beyond out into the high seas. And as they move, they're subject to various protections that don't necessarily overlap or potentially even apply at all, depending on which part of their natural range they happen to be in. So while MPAs, marine protected areas, and site-specific refuges, those are a reasonable course, but they're also incomplete for such a mobile species. Thus, the call for what we call either ecological corridors or ecologically connected pathways that could potentially link areas of protection based on ecological conditions, like they might just be seasonal, and they might be seasonal based on the presence of zooplankton. That is an exciting step forward that is being explored, but is also really difficult to implement. And last but not least, the climate. A 2023 study found that basking sharks actually have a lot greater temperature flexibility than we thought they did, which is awesome. But it's unclear how climate change is going to affect their seasonal movement for seasonal migrators like these guys. So as prey availability changes due to rising ocean temperatures, one model from last year, well, 2024, 2 years ago, predicts a northward shift into subarctic waters in the Atlantic and the Pacific. So one thing I found in this research is there is also a lot of disagreement about what the farthest north sighting of basking sharks are. I have one from University of Alaska's research vessel that was in the Gulf of Alaska, but once we get to the Gulf of Alaska and I start disentangling descriptions from the archives, then we also throw in sleeper sharks, which get even bigger, and it becomes even harder. But the northward shift, potentially in the next couple of decades, is really interesting, both for those ecosystems and for the biology of the individual shark. But obviously, we need more dynamic modeling with more variables if we're really going to understand how the shifts in oceanographic conditions will affect the species in our area. So that's where we are now. But let's look ahead a little bit. The looming extinction of the basking shark from the Northeast Pacific is not a foregone conclusion. It's just not. Rather, I think it's a radical opportunity for sustained transboundary and transdisciplinary collaboration with positive ecological and cultural outcomes. So megafauna like basking sharks play vital roles in our environmental health and the environmental health of the waters they inhabit. By consuming such enormous amounts of plankton, they recycle nutrients, of course, which is a nice way of saying they poop a lot because they're giant. They enhance primary productivity, which stabilizes every trophic level, including us. And beyond ecology, we might also look to our regional cultural identity, who we are based on our place-based identity. And a return of basking sharks to the Northeast Pacific is also a return of basking sharks holding a place alongside orcas and salmon in our imagination of our own waters. I sometimes ask my students to think about how your life, or even just your conception of your marine space and your space, would be different if you knew there were school bus-sized sharks in your community, if they were your neighbors too. Like, how would your life be different, or at least the way you think about the community you live in? Ireland and Scotland, where some of the rebound, the recovery has gone in a pretty positive direction, basking shark-wise, they have an extremely robust seasonal basking shark tourism network. All right, so there are conservation codes of conduct. They've really built it up from scratch. Basking Shark Scotland is one of those. This is their photo that really solidify the relationships between sharks and the human community. I presented at the Global Basking Shark Conference, which was in Ireland this year, and even the iconography of the basking shark is everywhere. People are excited about them. They love them, and they love to tell people about them. And from an economic perspective, people come to see the sharks. They learn more about the community. And it's been, at least in the communities we've been to, a really positive thing, both for sharks and humans. So in 2010, Canadian DFO, Department of Fisheries, published a recovery strategy for the shark in Canadian waters under the Species at Risk program. They followed that up in 2016 and then in 2020 with an action plan. They're kind of light years ahead of the US at the moment in terms of conservation. At this time, research in the US centered around several West Coast universities. So most notably, Oregon State's Big Fish Lab is doing really incredible basking shark work. NOAA's Southwest Marine Fisheries Lab in San Diego has historically been a basking shark hub as well, although of course, federal funding to much of NOAA has been inconsistent or cut entirely in the last year. And in Mexico, this is really exciting. Research at the Department of Biological Oceanography at the Ensenada Center for Scientific Research has just started cataloging sightings, historical sightings, and interactions with basking sharks along the Baja coast, which has not been a part of their range that much research has been done on before now. So I'm really excited to see what comes of that. First Nations and Indigenous community organizations also continue to monitor and protect local waters, adding to the centuries of ecological knowledge. And multiple of the most recent sightings, actually in the last 10 years, have only been documented thanks to the First Nations Guardians Program, which combines traditional stewardship practices with scientific monitoring. And of course, the Salish Sea Institute here at Western has become the home of the Basking Shark Working Group, which encompasses researchers from all of those logos on the previous slide, with the aim of sharing knowledge across borders and disciplines. So the paper that this talk is based on is a product of the first 2 years of that collaboration. And the broad vision of the working group is a return of basking sharks to the Northeast Pacific Ocean region to numbers where sightings are not infrequent, right? Where you have a chance. My colleague Romney McPhee, who also made this awesome coloring page, which you can download, calls the basking shark a poster child for shifting baseline syndrome, which I think is perfect. They have been largely erased from our cultural memory on the west coast of North America just within the course of one lifetime. Several of the most recent documented sightings, though, haven't actually come from researchers. With more community education, the public can play a role in recovery. The last 2 Washington State sightings have just come from recreational water folks, just people out on the water. Public education exponentially broadens the search for these animals and also makes it more likely that identifications are accurate. Because if you don't know basking sharks are even a possibility, if you see that fin, you might think it's a different kind of shark. They do get mistaken for white sharks a lot. You might think it's a whale. A really amazing thing about basking sharks, they can actually breach, throw their entire body out of the water. So of course you're going to think that's a whale if you see it from a distance and you don't know that basking sharks are on the menu of possible animals that you're going to see today. So we don't even know how many people might actually be seeing them and not knowing what they're seeing. So in Canada, they have this lovely brochure, which encourages you to report to their Pacific Biological Station. US sightings now go to Oregon State's Big Fish Lab. That's where we decided they're all going. So the history of the basking shark in the 20th century is yet another example of the industrial and colonial approach to the natural world, which has caused the decimation or outright extinction of plants and animals across North America. It's a multidisciplinary problem requiring a multidisciplinary solution. And that huge blade that I talked about that was once affixed to Comox Post, the ship, is now on display actually at the Alberni Valley Museum on Vancouver Island. You can go see it. And it's just this emblem, I think, of the coordinated effort of some men to cleave humans from nature, from the natural world. So to recover the basking shark in the Salish Sea and the Northeast Pacific will also take a coordinated effort, albeit a far more sustained one. So my last question for you is, what do humpback whales, harbor porpoises, and stellar sea lions all hopefully have in common with basking sharks? What do you think? Humpback whales, harbor porpoises, stellar sea lions. What do you think? What do they hopefully have in common with our baskers? Any guesses? Cindy knows because she wrote a paper about it. She was instrumental in the research about one of these guys, yeah. Estudiantes, anybody? Yeah. They can be saved. What a perfect way to put it. Exactly. I was going to say more long-windedly, these are all large animals whose populations were once decimated, but are now trending toward recovery in the Salish Sea. Yeah. It's some hope. It's something. We should take them, humpback whales, harbor porpoises, stellar sea lions, we should take them as evidence that this progress is possible, even just in my lifetime. We never saw humpbacks when I was a kid. Now, I saw one with my class last semester from the classroom down at Highline. Yeah. So with that, I'd love to open it up to some discussion. And I'd especially love if students here, if you want to make some connections to your other coursework, things that sound, like I've heard that before. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Lay it on me. Thanks, Cindy. And I should say all the porpoise work. If you have porpoise questions, ask Cindy. Yeah.
So we have a few minutes before class is over. So does anybody have any questions? And if you can repeat the question.
I shall, yeah. And if you don't have to go, I'll hang around a little bit too. We can chat.
Why are they so large compared to their body, and why do you harvest the oil?
Great question. So the question is about the basking shark liver. Why are they so much larger than other sharks' livers comparatively, and why did humans care? So I think actually the really interesting part of that is why humans care. Because they're larger for lots of reasons having to do with their life history and the time that they spend deep and cold. But during World War II especially, there was a need for an enormous amount of industrial lubrication. Something that today we'd probably use silicone or something like that for. But all of the squalene that's in that vitamin A essentially, that's in the basking shark livers was probably the best, most readily available industrial lubricant at that time. So that's what they wanted it for. There was also some use, I know it's so gross. There's also some use in vitamin A supplements that people would take, but then it was realized that basking shark, the vitamin A that comes out of basking shark livers is not nearly as potent as what comes out of other shark livers, which is still something you want to look at on your cosmetics, et cetera, today. Squalene does still come, depending on where it comes from, shark livers.
Liver is helped with white teeth.
Yes, exactly.
White shark.
Yep, yeah, she's got no swim bladder, so it's on the liver. Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. Yeah, so are the sharks in Ireland and Scotland a different species from the Pacific Northwest? They're not. They're Cedarinis maximus. They're not even a different ecotype. Like, we have multiple ecotypes of orca here in the Salish Sea. They are biologically the same. Behaviorally, they do some different things. And so you might want to check out Alex McInturf has authored some really great papers about sharks in the California current ecosystem and in Ireland. Yeah, that's a great question too.
Elaborate on shifting baseline theory?
Oh yeah, so shifting baseline syndrome. Just coined, oh my gosh, I can't even think of the when now. But when we say shifting baseline syndrome, we mean something that was really common in, say, our grandparents' time that is no longer now, that has changed so quickly that we don't even think about it. So when Romney says the basking sharks are a poster child for shifting baseline syndrome, she's saying that they were once part of our cultural identity, they were well known, and now in such a short period of time, we no longer even think about them or know that they were even once here at all. Yeah, it's a great question.
We have online.
Oh yeah.
Do
do basking sharks always swim around with this gnawing gape of an open mouth, or is it feeding behavior only? Is it likely that at the surface we would likely see and identify them this way?
So do they always swim around with the big mouth open? And at the surface, would we identify them that way? Pretty much yes, when they're feeding. But it is, like the question says, it's a feeding behavior. So if they're on plankton, the mouth is going to be open. And a really extraordinary view from above is that their particular gill slits essentially go all the way to their vertebra. They're so enormous, it almost looks like, how could their head even stay on? It's really unique. Yeah, you can kind of see it from there.
To get a repeat of the four important things that megafauna like the basking shark does for us.
Oh yeah, what do? Yeah, let me go back. So what do important big giant megafauna like the basking shark do for us? Let me get that slide back. Yep, so when they eat such huge quantities of plankton, then they recycle those nutrients in their waste. Who eats the waste? All the little guys, enhancing primary productivity. So I've got some little phytoplankton and sun on there. So they're able to photosynthesize better, thus stabilizing every energy level or every tendril of the food web, including us.
Because
Did you say where or how?
on the surface or below, because whales, we know, is fertilizing the ocean whale pump poop thing. They can't poop at depth, so they come to the surface changing those nutrients. Do we know where they poop?
If someone does, that person's not me. Where? I have no idea. I have never seen any research about that. But it is important. It would be important to know. Yeah. Yeah. I've never heard of the basking shark pump the same way I've heard of the whale pump, so it would be interesting to know.
We have time for one more question before the class go over to Rachel will say after. Are you just studying basking sharks or any other sharks?
Basking sharks have really been my world for the last year or so. Mostly I study species that come into contact with fisheries and with human fisheries. But so earlier last summer, kind of expanded out to 6 gills, did some 6 gill work because we do seasonally get 6 gills at dive depth. So did some signage around that down in Des Moines. But yeah, and after basking sharks, I don't know who's next. Maybe megamouth.
What has the reporting status been telling us about their sightings or deaths over the last decade or two? Do you think reporting is doing a good job of reviewing data or not?
Is reporting doing a good job of revealing data or not? That's a great question. I think scientifically, one of the hardest things to do to study the sharks is just to find them. And so we have very few data points there, but the data that they do gather is significant. But that speaks to public education because we don't know how many data points we could be capturing if people knew to look for them. Yeah. So I deputize you all now as you are now basking shark sighting associates.
So class is ended. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
This is the paper.